the socialist project that has been struggling in fits and starts to emerge since 1917, at least in material form, is a project that is going to continue to galvanize, and I would anticipate increasingly galvanize people. But we have to look at that in a global perspective, because at the same time, what you clearly have within capitalist countries, particularly within the imperialist core, is a resurgence of fascism. And so with the crises of capitalism and the inability on the part of the ruling class to take care of these crises, because they're irresolvable ultimately, the propagandists, as well as the capitalist ruling class, have a well-known, tried and true solution to that. And that is to try to do a kind of bait and switch where they bait people into various fascist forms of politics that ultimately have the goal of shoring up the capitalist system and intensifying imperialism. And so in the US context, we also have very powerful fascist organizations, and we have a government and a capitalist ruling class that either work hand in glove with the fascists or at least accommodate and maintain their presence, because they always want to keep their bogeyman kind of on call for when push comes to shove and they need to crush the socialist alternative by any means necessary.
When you say fascist, like who would you define as the fascist organizations?
Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, the militia movement, the White Power movement, the Klan, of course, the deep history of one of the things that's interesting is when the Italian fascists first arrived on the scene, and then the term fascism was introduced into the English language via the Italian language. Many in the US recognized that the Italian fascists were simply a European version of the Klan, because they were pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist, anti-socialist, and they were doing the vigilante work that was allowed by the government, when we're talking about the black shirts, for instance, in the exact same way that the KKK was often allowed to act with impunity on the part of organizations like the FBI or the police or other forms of law enforcement within the United States. And so I think there is a very well-documented history of fascist organizations. The thing that's, I think, difficult but important to analyze is that fascism comes in many different forms. It's not just swastikas and jackboots. We have plenty of that. Look at the Ukraine or look elsewhere, or in the United States. Plenty of people with swastika tattoos here. But given that fascism often takes on ultra-nationalist forms, Dimitrov, the famous communist analyst of fascism, claimed that when fascism arrives in the United States, it will arrive draped in the American flag and singing hymns to patriotism, right? It'll all be about U.S. exceptionalism, et cetera. It'd be MAGA, Make America Great Again, right? Yeah. And so in that regard, there is a very important fascist movement in the United States. And in the wake of January 6th, with Biden coming into office, there was not a serious crackdown on these organizations. There was a kind of propaganda campaign and a need to at least do something. And so you have some of the heads of these organizations who just recently received prison terms going up to, I believe, between 15, maybe 18 years is the maximum sentence, which is about half of what the prosecutors were seeking. And the organizations have not been shut down and continue to operate, even though some of the leadership has run into some legal problems. So it's alive and well in the United States for sure. And a real danger, of course, to socialist organizing, because one of the main goals of fascism is to crush the real opponents of capitalism, who are the socialists, the communists, the anarchists, anyone basically who's on the hard left.
So in the electoral realm, then, I mean, those groups you name, I mean, they are, very much like wearing it on the sleeve. Literally, in most cases, they usually have some sort of decor on their sleeves. But getting into the electoral realm, like I would say, I consider Ron DeSantis a straight up Nazi. I think that guy is the most dangerous person in American politics, second to none. If he were to ever enter the White House, I've already talked to my wife about it. I want to get out of this country as soon as we safely can. Trump, I think Trump's just a freaking narcissist who has like no ideology whatsoever. Not saying he isn't dangerous. I just think he's just a narcissistic loon. Um, and then getting into the other side of it. I mean, it's like you look at a lot of fascistic by definition policies that are pushed by corporate Democrats like Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg. So do you think there's any alternative right now in the electoral realm?
Not amongst the Democrats and the Republicans, because I couldn't
Mhm.
agree more that if you want to analyze fascism, you have to do it internationally. And you see this very clearly with the US undying support for what is basically a totalitarian regime in the Ukraine controlled by Zelensky, and the funding of fascist battalions that have been extremely, this funding has, and the battalions themselves has been extremely well documented. And so regardless of whether or not it's a Democrat or Republican who comes into office, US imperialism and the US support of fascism internationally will continue. Right. So that's a negative. Regarding fascism domestically, I think that we have to, and George Jackson's a great analyst on this front, identify at least two different forms of fascism. One is just the nature of the US police state and the mass incarceration system, everything that goes into the kind of quote unquote legal fascism. And that will continue unabated. Again, whether or not it's a Democrat or a Republican, we see this very clearly with Biden's longstanding history of supporting racist policies, being involved in the mass incarceration system, et cetera, et cetera. The fascist movements are a third element to that, like the movements that were empowered by Trump that I mentioned a moment ago. If Trump, someone like DeSantis, comes into office, then we are looking at a significant uptick in that type of activity. And that means that I think it would be increasingly dangerous for various forms of organizing, whether or not it be, labor organizing or social movement organizing or other such things within the US context. And it also depends on what exactly that will look like over time, because uh, fascists historically have come into, like full-blooded fascists have come into office largely as opportunists who have been bankrolled by the capitalist ruling class or segments of the capitalist ruling class who are looking to solve the problem of how to increase capitalist accumulation and beat back the socialist threat. And it's clear within the US context that there are segments of the capitalist ruling class that support a kind of fascist option, a more directly fascist option, in the sense of supporting presidential candidates that would support these fascist movements and potentially also increase the two other forms of fascism that I mentioned, both imperialist fascism and the kind of fascist police state. And so one of the conundrums right now, I think, for some of the capitalist ruling class is what to do when faced with the fact that you do have an empire that is facing various forms of decadence, meaning various ways in which it's kind of coming apart at the seams. How do you shore that up? Well, one of them is you look at historical examples and you follow them. And in fact, in 1934, this is exactly what a group of Democrats did who were anti-FDR. They collaborated with JP Morgan and a whole series of other members of the capitalist ruling class and they made plans for a fascist coup d'etat, in which they studied Hitler, Mussolini, and examples of fascism within France. And we now know through the business plot, this is all part of the public record, that there was a conspiracy to establish a fascist dictatorship. That was the term that was used within the United States. And so we shouldn't think by any stretch of the imagination that somehow we're immune to these types of politics.